Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren Cass. I am the chief economist here at American Compass, and we've got a fascinating conversation for you today with Sam Pressler, who is a fellow at the University of Virginia, a research affiliate at Harvard's Human Flourishing Program, and does just a lot of fascinating work on social capital, relationships, what he calls the adult transition, which I think is especially important. He writes something called Connective Tissue on a policy framework for the role of government in connection in American communities. And especially you should be sure to read the piece he wrote for us at the Commons last month, From the Great Connector to the Great Sorter, which looks in particular at the role that college plays in the adult transition today, and as a result, what that means for the majority of Americans who are still not completing college. So we talk about that concept of adult transition, how it's changed over time, how we're leaving the majority of Americans behind in the way we do it today, and then a whole bunch of policy ideas for how we might be better at it. So stick around for that. But of course, first you must listen to me tell you what else is going on at American Compass this week. Actually, a related piece on the Commons, really interesting, from Chris Bullivant of the Social Capital Campaign, called You Gotta Have Relationships to Make Relationships, looking at a somewhat related concept of how, social capital is all well and good, but it's really cross-class social capital, the relationships that connect people to different parts of American life that are especially important for upward mobility in particular. And also a great piece from our very own Drew Holden will be coming later in the week on responsive politics and durable governing majorities and what we can do to maybe turn down the temperature a little bit on our politics, at least in the future. We will be publishing a major new survey, maybe our biggest to date, of American attitudes and values, which I think really does an interesting job challenging typical notions of the American dream. So you'll be seeing us talking a lot about that. And one place I will be talking about it, of course, is on my Substack. So if you are not already subscribed to Understanding America, head on over to understandingamerica.co. It will, of course, bring you great social capital connections and help in your own adult transition. But for now, we will talk about all of that with Sam Pressler. And joining us now is Sam Pressler. Sam, how are you doing?
I'm doing great this morning. How are you?
I am doing all right. Really excited for this conversation. You wrote a fantastic piece for the Commons, I guess a few weeks ago now, on social connection and the great connector versus the great sorter, and sort of what has happened to the transition to adulthood in America, particularly for those who don't get to kind of go hang out and do ice-breaking exercises on a college campus for a few years. Which is an issue we are very interested in from both the social and economic angles here at American Compass. But I guess I kind of wanted to start here just with the way you sort of conceive of adult transition generally. What is it, and how has it changed in America over the generations, I guess?
Yeah, so for the purposes of the paper I wrote for y'all and for the broader policy framework, I kind of think of the adult transition as this kind of transitional period between childhood and adulthood. And it's this like 18 to 22-year-old time where kind of in current day we think about people, going to college or four-year colleges. And what I kind of trace is the emergence of the first this national or state mediated version of the adult transition during World War II, with the creation of kind of the large standing military that kind of brought, by the mid 1950s, 1960s, the majority of men in their 20s, 30s, and 40s had served in the military. And it was this remarkably cross-geography, cross-class experience of the adult transition that also kind of cultivated these habits of participation in these kind of relationships that carried with those who served for the rest of their lives. And how that actually started to shift following World War II, in part because of the GI Bill of Rights, which, as Paul Tough wrote in one of his books, it actually opened up colleges to the masses from this kind of aristocratic experience to one that is more open to people who served in the military. But then at the same time that the GI Bill opened colleges up, we saw a few things change in American life. First was the military in 1973 transitioned from this kind of large conscription force to the all-volunteer force, which over time shifted from, a large plurality of the population serving in the military to, at this point, less than 1% of the population serving at any given time. And at the same time, around that same time period, we saw the kind of creation of this meritocratic system of higher education, which was kind of measurement-based and really about kind of pulling out the so-called best and brightest to kind of attend colleges. And essentially what happened, and this is something that Robert Putnam writes about in Our Kids, it's something that Richard Reeves writes about in Dream Hoarders, is that the top 2 quintile of earning parents started to game that system for the benefits of their children, to the extent that today you see just the majority of people in kind of these selective 4-year colleges are kind of the children of the top 2 quintile earners. And so that's some of the shift that's happened. I think the so what, and kind of what I get to in the piece that's like worth naming, is as college has become this anchor of the adult transition, this kind of structured experience where, particularly for people like me who went to 4-year colleges, it's really this like great connector within the people who are going, given the cohort-based experience. The alternative, if you're not in the 1% that's joined the military, is just in many ways non-existent in kind of a structural form. So if you're not going to 4-year college, maybe you're going to a 2-year school, many of those people are kind of working part-time, maybe they're commuting, they're not having that same kind of cohort-based experience, it's more disconnected. Or perhaps you're not going to college altogether, you're joining a workforce where you're entering jobs that are less stable, that have less predictability. And so you see this kind of diversion that's happened where during the period of the adult transition, we have one group that's kind of cultivating connections and habits of participation, often with people very similar to them from a class perspective. And then people who are not, unless they're joining the military, are not having that experience. And so the case I make is that this is one of the factors that is playing into the very large class divide in participation and social connectedness and social support in American civic life.
And I guess it's worth actually going back briefly to before the national system, because there's once upon a time adult transition also happened with neither military conscription nor college. And maybe it's oversimplifying to say, to some extent, the adult transition was you got married, right? I mean, I don't know if you've spent a lot of time studying it, but I do think it's worth, because one reaction a lot of people would have to your story is, well, wait a minute, why do we need a quote, national or federalized adult transition? Isn't adult transition just sort of something that happens? And so how did it happen, or why doesn't it just happen?
Yeah, so my understanding of this, and this is, I'm not an expert on this by any means, is that prior to World War II, it was very much kind of locally rooted experiences of the adult transition. I'm a big fan of Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry often writes about kind of the work of local culture to form kind of the adults and community members that we've become. And so in many ways, it was this much more dispersed, geographically much more locally rooted experience. Where you would maybe not even call it the adult transition, but you would call it, there were some sort of rite of passage that was kind of focused on the formation of the community member that you may become. I introduce World War II as kind of this inflection point where we actually shifted that period from a really local experience to one that was actually shaped by and driven by a set of kind of federal policies and more national level decision making.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so essentially what we have today now is a situation where, as you said, there's basically an assumption that everybody goes to high school until they're 18. Mm-hmm. And I always try to remind folks, let's not forget we've still got upwards of 10% not even completing high school, plus probably close to 10% who are earning something that is called a diploma, but does not necessarily bear much relationship to what we would think of high school completion as. And then you have this crazy phenomenon where everybody walks across the stage, gets their diploma, and then kind of goes out one of two different doors. And one of these doors is off to college, and more than 50% are now going straight on to college. Though to your point, college doesn't necessarily mean leafy quad and a dorm. For an awful lot of people, it means commuter, part-time, community college, and so forth. Or you're just going through the door where you are not then enrolled in anything. And I don't think for everybody who goes through the first door, there's real sort of thinking about what that gap means, because you end up with the situation, especially when we think about how we allocate our public resources, where we are essentially dumping hundreds of billions of dollars a year onto the heads of people going through door one. And door two essentially becomes almost instantly just invisible. My favorite example, I was doing something at Ohio State, and I remember why I just happened to notice that Ohio State had a program, even if you're living off campus, here's kind of the office to come to get your smoke alarm. Mm-hmm. And it was just like, why is it that the state of Ohio has a policy that if you're going to college and you're between the age of 18 and 22, here's where to go to get your free smoke alarm. And if you're not going to go to college, I guess you better go get your own smoke alarm. But that's obviously a very small microcosm, but that multiplies across everything about life. And so, what does that mean? I mean, what are the consequences in the social data? We see it down the road in divergent economic outcomes, obviously, but I think one thing you do a nice job of is really underscoring, first of all, much more immediately in young people's lives at that over time, and then very quickly how this plays out in totally different experiences, opportunities, and outcomes.
Yeah. One report that I recently put out with Dan Cox at the Survey Center on American Life really kind of looked at the kind of class divides in our social experiences, thinking about it from, I won't call this a causal story, but at least a sequential story from kind of civic opportunities, the places and spaces where we can experience community, to the kind of how, your participation, your membership in community, then through to who you build relationships with, your friendships, and then to what I would say is the so what, which is the social support you receive. And what we saw in that data is significant differences in all of those things. So in terms of kind of civic opportunity, if you don't have a college degree, you're 2 times less likely to have access to kind of civic opportunity in your community, whether that be a park or a library or a coffee shop or a pub or any of those types of things. You are 3 times less likely to be involved in any form of community group. You're 13% less likely to be involved in a religious group, which is still free in many ways. You're half as likely to be in a union. And then when it comes to friendship, we see this gap that's emerged by kind of college degree, where in 1990, 2% of people with degrees and 3% of people without degrees said they had no close friends. In 2024, we see 10% of people with degrees have no close friends, but then 24% of people without degrees say they have no close friends. And that's just a massive gap. And I think when I share that piece, I also think about not just from a data perspective, like what is the experiential quality of life when you don't have any friends to turn to? Like that is not just a kind of social issue, that is like in some ways a kind of spiritual and more deeply emotional issue. Then finally, it translates to the social support, which is, I think, actually quite practical. Oftentimes we talk about social disconnectedness as tied to, deaths of despair or kind of democratic backsliding or economic immobility. But there's actually a very practical element of this. Like, if you don't have a college degree, you're much less likely to have the social support that can catch you when you're falling. So, significantly lower levels of having someone who can offer you a place to stay if you need it, offering you $200 in a time of need, and just offering to listen to you in a difficult time. And so that is not all due to this period of life, the adult transition, But it struck, in the conversations I was having about that research, it struck me as very interesting that no one was asking about that period of time, because that is the period of time where we're seeing this divergence really happen. And so in the piece, I wanted to say, like, hey, we should be looking at the adult transition as kind of a sorting function that is, if not driving this, at least contributing to these kind of disparate social outcomes.
Well, and it's actually really funny, you're sort of being very modest in the, causal versus sequential and so forth thing, which is, it's always wise. But one thing that really jumps out at me is we've sort of went through a long period where we stripped the causality out of college, right? Like where people start to say, well, wait a minute, it's not that, you're more economically successful because of everything you learned in college. College is mostly a signaling function about the types of people who succeed in college. And so we started using college more as this kind of, marker of whether it is sort of purely class characteristics or academic ability, whatever you want to say. It was truly a sorting function. And we started to sort of discount that anything valuable really happens at college, which by the way, may in fact be true as far as the college classroom goes. But it got us to the point where, you mentioned Robert Putnam's Our Kids. It was right at the same time Charles Murray put out Coming Apart with his sort of upper middle class Belmont and his lower working class Fishtown, and all of these kind of dramatic divergences in outcomes. And certainly myself reading it, my assumption was, okay, this is telling us a lot about basically the types of people who do and don't have college degrees and how they then experience America and the economy and so forth. I don't think there is a lot of attention given to the point that you are making, which strikes me as entirely right, which is like, no, something really important does happen at college. College is not just a signaling device, but the important thing isn't the educational thing. The important thing is the social thing. And we really are using college to essentially execute this transition, in a sense, for one set of people, and both failing to equip the people with the tangible skills that in a lot of times come with college, learning little by little how to live on your own, learning things about a job and, how to show up for that internship or whatever it is. Literally being trained on how to produce, prepare a resume and do an interview and buy a shirt and so forth. And then setting people off with this set of relationships that is so vital, and leaving the other half without it. Is there any causal research on it? Do you have any causal research in the works? Because the kind of social value of college seems like something that hasn't been studied in that way very much.
Yeah, I got a question on this recently as well, and I didn't immediately have kind of causal research to it, but what I did try to do is reflect on kind of my experience of choosing colleges and my experience just of college now, obviously with the privilege of hindsight, and situating myself in, the priorities of an 18-year-old boy, like a huge element of what I was thinking about were the social dynamics, right? It was like, are there going to be fun football games on the weekend? Is there, what role does Greek life play versus other clubs? Like, who are the type of people, when you're reading these college reviews, is it like too nerdy of a group of people who go there? Is it more of a jockey group of people that go there? And then like on the tours, you're there and half of the tour, if not more than half of the tour, is about campus life. It's not about like what classes you're taking. And then, by the way, on the back end, the entire pitch is not like, let's reflect on all the things that you've learned. It's like, here's all the different ways you could plug into your alumni network, which are the people that either you've met through college or who, vis-a-vis this connection to an institution, you have some relationship with. And so, to your point on like, it's kind of at the surface level, this is the pitch of college, right? Like, I think even the research on the ideological lack of diversity at college is like, kids are going to college and then they're just becoming, these far left people. It's like, it's not really that you're being indoctrinated. It's because you're in group dynamics where like it's belonging before belief, and you end up feeling like you belong to this group. And then as part of belonging to that group, you're believing some of these things. And so if we just take a step back and say, how did I think about college? What was my experience of it? It's almost not surprising at all that like this is what's happening to people who've gone to college. And then if you don't, and the point I was partially trying to make in the piece is like, we just don't have cohort-based experiences if you're not joining the military, right? Like it is largely the case that, you know, these community colleges are fragmented. If you're joining the workforce, you're not having that cohort. And for a large portion of kind of prime age males who are not going into the workforce at all, like, what are you doing? And so it's just, there are economic benefits to college that I don't want to discount, but there are certain kind of structural things that potentially can be designed as alternatives that can at least mitigate some of these disparities.
Right. And I want to get into the kind of the structural and the policy side in a sec. I had one other kind of question about the descriptive side. I can't remember if this was in the piece you wrote for us or more broadly in the connective tissue project, but it really jumped out at me the point that even if you are going straight into a job, the way that the labor market itself has changed plays into this too. That, you know, whether we're thinking about kind of union density and the difference between potentially going into an organized workplace versus almost certainly now one that's not, or even more generally just, you know, likely going into a job that is not expected to be long-term, that the employer probably isn't thinking of as long-term. Increasingly, you even have kind of more gig economy type work that is not really a job in the traditional sense at all. That just fascinated me. And again, I thought a lot in terms of the economic implications of it, but as a kind of failed point of adult transition, it seems to me not something maybe not saying we realized we'd miss until it's gone. And maybe most people don't even realize we're missing it now that it is gone. Yeah,
right. It's this 1-2 of, you know, you're simultaneously less likely to be joining a kind of private sector union job where you're not only getting the support structure that comes from that private sector union, but also the kind of social element of being in that union. It's that those jobs for people without degrees have been replaced by more service and retail sector jobs that are much more precarious in nature. One of my advisors, a guy named Danny Schneider, runs the Shift Project at Harvard. He kind of talks about the kind of double-edged sword of being in this type of unpredictable and precarious work that you join, right? So on one hand, you don't have any control over your schedule to be able to plan to spend time with people, right? Like I can't plan to spend time with my friends. I can't, if I have a family, it's hard to spend time with my family, hard to plan to spend time to go to a religious group or a community group. And if you're in those jobs, it's simultaneously taxing your more limited support network more. Because let's say I just find out that my shift gets changed or gets canceled. Now I need to go figure out someone who can do childcare for my kid that I wasn't planning for. And that's an additional tax. And so it's this kind of double punishment, right? Where you have less control and that makes it harder to spend time with people. And potentially even more, that smaller social support network you have to tap on more and more emergency situations, and that strains it even further. And so that is how big of a component is a question, but that is a component of if you're not going to college and the kind of type of precarious workplace that you're potentially joining. Yeah, I was going to say it's a triple-edged sword, although I guess maybe it has to be a ninja star at that point or something. But because on top of it, it's a great point. It becomes harder to kind of build that social support. You, in fact, suddenly need more of it in theory. And there's also the fact that in that kind of job, you are getting less of the potential social connection in the job itself. So you simultaneously are in a job that is not a good place for social connection. It is precluding you from creating other social connection, and it is leaving you more in need of social connection all at the same time. Yeah, so, I miss the within workplace piece. That's a really good. So if you want to call that the ninja star of labor precarity, you can. That title is up for grabs as far as I'm concerned. But all right, let's talk more about kind of the structural solution side of things. Saying that the Connective Tissue Project does a lot of work on. What are some of the options? What's at the top of your list, kind of both from a framework perspective and then concretely? Yeah, I think specifically focusing on this period of the adult transition within the framework, we have an entire chapter that's on life transitions, and one of those life transitions that we focus on is the adult transition for many of the reasons that we've been talking about so far. What I did in that section was try to surface things that are already moving to identify where there can be potential policy progress, but I'll just name that this is definitely an all of the above approach is needed. And so the things that I'm sharing are not the be all end all, but I think are potential points where we can see real movement. And so the first thing that I'm particularly excited about is the kind of reemergence or the emergence of state level service years. We've seen this in Maryland with Governor Wes Moore making it a policy priority, and we've seen it in California with California volunteers in their service year. And I'll just say I interviewed several governors' offices as part of this policy framework, and many of them pointed to kind of these state-level service years as areas of real interest for them. Why I find them so interesting is because...
say a little bit more. What is a service year?
Yeah, please. Yeah. Essentially, these state-level service years are one-year service programs for people graduating high school before they go to college, before they go into workforce, before they go into vocational training, where they are both embedding in a service project within the state, but also connected to a cohort-based experience of other people in that age group doing that type of a similar service project. And what this essentially does is takes this kind of long-term kind of centrist vision, I think, of doing national public service, and somewhat devolves it to the states to do it. And we're seeing kind of progress in that regard. And so I see it as a really interesting potential option to, you're not going to get everyone to do this, but if you start to get, many of these programs have a goal of getting the plurality of graduating high school students to do 1 year of service before they go on to the next step. That creates this cross-class, cross-geography, cross-ideology experience of the adult transition. And when you layer in the cohort-based programming, the engagement with the peers, you could actually start to see the potential to reverse some of the dynamics that we're talking about. It won't eliminate them because a lot of people will want to go on to college, but it can have the potential to create that shared experience. And so that is one program that I think is really interesting. It's in its early stages, both in Maryland and California. I think it's not just something that I've, at least from my conversation with governors, that left-leaning states want to do. I've seen more bipartisan interest in something like it. And you could imagine a future in which, if this were to, go to 5 states, 10 states, 15 states, then there could be a role for potential federal coordination around kind of promoting exchanges between states. So I do my service, I'm from Maryland, but I'm going to do my service in California and vice versa, and the potential coordination over time of benefits that might be tied to it. So that's the service year piece that I think has a lot of heat, and I think a potential momentum there. The other...
two questions about service year, because I think it's a fascinating idea. The two concerns I always have about it they're really just questions. One is, do we know empirically at this point who is in fact taking advantage of it? That is it reaching the people who are ill-served by the current system, or is it a gap year to burnish your college application?
Yeah. So my understanding in the Maryland and California context is that part of their recruitment process is really building that kind of intentional representation of the entire state. But I think the real fear is that it just becomes a gap year for kids who already would have been able to have a gap year and not have the state pay for it. So I think that is part of the process. I also would, my sense is that at the current scale, it's pretty early to do that measure. But I do know that that's been a priority for both of those states.
Yeah, and then the second question is, in the spirit of office space, sort of, what would you say you do here? Where I have seen service type frameworks work or not work it seems to me to turn significantly on whether there is actually a meaningful thing that people are being organized to do versus does it feel like a bunch of make work gap fill, because what can a bunch of kids in 1 year after high school really do that's useful?
Yeah, and I think that's to the extent that this is modeled after some of the AmeriCorps programs, I do think that's like a legitimate critique. And I'm guessing that that's probably the experience of some people who participate in the programs. I think, the response would be, on my end, still probably not a reason to not do it. And I think, too, the potential to like, what is it over time, what does it look like to build in more meaningful experiences for the kid? Because I think, I'm talking a lot in this around connection, but a data point I share in the piece I wrote for you all is 60% of 18 to 25-year-olds say they have no sense of purpose or meaning in life. And they didn't break that data down by whether or not those 18 to 25-year-olds serve in the military, but I would venture to guess that the 18 to 25-year-olds who are doing military service, that number would be much lower. And so to the extent that this can not just be work that in a period of time that connects young people across various lines of difference, but also actually engenders a sense of like, my life has meaning and purpose beyond kind of, the kind of stale technologically mediated world that I'm finding myself living in. I think that could be a real win. And so I guess my answer to your question is yes, and I think there is still kind of potential opportunity.
All right. So keep going. What else is on the list?
Yeah, so that's the first big one. I think the second big one, and this is even more emergent, but I like the idea and its potential for mass scale as well, is something called these like domestic exchange programs. So taking the idea of international exchange programs where you go, I live in the U.S. and I go to Germany or vice versa, and doing that within the U.S. domestic context. And so one group in particular is pioneering this. They're called the American Exchange Project. And they're doing really cool stuff, like taking a cohort of kids from Palo Alto and placing them in rural Texas and kind of vice versa, and having that shared experience. And that is it's a shorter period of intervention. It's a few weeks. But what it is really focused on is providing a cohort-based experience for really geographically, ideologically, class diversity of young people, and having that kind of experience of connection across difference. They're now working with state legislatures in a number of states to actually start getting partial state funding to facilitate those exchanges. And you could imagine a situation in which with state education dollars or state service dollars, this being really scaled to tens or hundreds of thousands of kids who are having this type of experience. And that, again, is another way that we can start to undo the sorting machine of the adult transition process.
That's interesting also, because I guess that's a whole other kind of category of problem we haven't really touched on, but that's connected to this, is the sort of broader problems in small d democratic politics in this country, in national solidarity or lack thereof, and the extent to which, maybe we didn't need that as much in the very localized kind of pre-industrial economy. Then we had this period where we did have these extraordinarily kind of homogenizing and cross-class, cross-cultural exchanges happening. And now we're in this situation where, for a significant share of people, they just don't have a lot of exposure to much outside of their own experience, or much opportunity to get outside of that. And yet we seem to be in a world where that is increasingly necessary for, not just for individuals to function, but for the society to function in a sense.
Yeah, and I think there is that kind of small d democracy angle to this, and the experiential quality of it. I'll just return back to this sense that this period of time in young people's lives does play this outsized role in kind of our relationships afterwards. So even as a small intervention point, right, this has the potential to just build these relationships that stay with you. And with the focus of the policy framework, and specifically with the piece, is that, right, is like, what are all the small ways that we can start to reduce this sorting that is about relationships, but it's also about, like, now the difference in whether you live a kind of quality life surrounded by friends or family, or die younger and alone. And I think that sometimes I like to frame it in that way. And I really like to frame this kind of discourse around loneliness not about loneliness, because I think loneliness is a highly individualized frame. I think it's about a structural form of aloneness that actually calls us into action towards some sort of collective accompaniment of sorts. And that's where we can actually see some of these interventions that start to reduce that sorting as in collaboration or combination with many other interventions, very worthwhile.
Yeah, interesting. All right, I'll give you one more, and then I've got one I want to run by you. I don't know or maybe if you have anything else on your list of big
big topics.
Policies.
Yeah, of course. I think the final piece, and I'll just name that you probably know more about this than I do, but if we think about for the people who are not going to college, right, what can we do during this kind of transitional period to make it more connected? It does strike me that this kind of alternative pathways conversation, which is really almost explicitly seem to be focused on like workforce and economic outcomes, should also consider some sort of kind of social outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. And to the extent that in the design of these programs, you're thinking about building cohort-based experiences that allow people to participate and build relationships with one another, that seems to be a kind of worthwhile yes, and as we're seeing the momentum to build more of these kind of alternative pathways in a more structured way. And so this is kind of the theme around a lot of the framework is like, we do need to increase housing supply and housing affordability, and housing can be this really high potential avenue for us to build a sense of connection in our communities. And so can we think about both the material and the social? I think there's a similar case to be made around these kind of alternative vocational pathways.
Yeah, that's a great point. As you said, it's something we do a lot of work on in the sort of economic, labor market terms. I would say we have not given very much thought at all to the question of, okay, but how do you design this also to have that sort of cohort-based element, which is a great point. It absolutely should. All right, so the one other one I wanted to throw at you is it seems to me, and this has been always stuck in my head since a long time ago. I was at some workforce development kind of dinner, found myself seated next to a woman from the Swiss embassy, and she was there to try to educate Americans about the Swiss apprenticeship system. Mm-hmm. It's kind of odd, like, why is this something the Swiss government is investing in? And she said, well, partly because Swiss companies come to the U.S. and you have nothing, and that's bad for us. Partly because American companies come to Switzerland and don't understand the apprenticeship system at all and muck it up, and that's bad for us too. So, like, well, that's all right. Those are good points. But we were talking about the kind of contrast between the systems, and she just said, I have to be honest, like, the American system of higher education is so baffling to Europeans. To someone like her, she said, and a little bit, Sam, to your point about like, what do you look at when you go on your college tour? She was like, we don't have that. Like, the college is like a building in the city where you go to some classes. And whether you are on a college pathway or a non-college pathway is a question of kind of what type of next training, learning are you doing after high school, but it isn't really a lifestyle choice. Mm-hmm. And obviously, I'm overgeneralizing. Obviously, there are plenty of leafy campuses in Europe also, but it got at something important, it seems to me, which is that we can talk a lot about all the ways we'd like to build up the non-college side, but the insane way that we do college in this country is itself a quite toxic force, in my opinion, mm-hmm. and one that, if left untouched, I don't know we can kind of overcome through equalization. In other words, mm-hmm. it seems to me that we are never going to build something that does what college does for people who don't have kind of the luxury of spending 4 years on a college campus. Mm-hmm. And given particularly how much we waste on those college campuses in many ways, it isn't kind of taking a sledgehammer to the existing college experience part of this? Like, shouldn't we sort of want to take those who, in a sense, it's wonderful they're benefiting from what college offers, though to your point about the kind of belonging over believing, it has its downsides as well. Should part of this be actually saying, no, we need to shove everybody on the college track back into the same adult transition pool that everybody else is in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really love that counterpoint. I mean, I hope the takeaway from this conversation is not that we should be replicating more things to be like college. I think to your point, there's a lot of ways in which college has lost sense of what its actual purpose is. And I fully agree with that frame. I think and this is just potentially the limits of of my intellectual and creative capacities. But I think the so what of that point you just made, Oren, is kind of where I get stuck. Like, how do you simultaneously elevate these alternatives and somewhat de-emphasize the importance of college in American life in a moment when the economic and social consequences of it feel so dire? And so I think that's the tension because I've thought about this question a lot, is like, I don't know how to undo that, and I'm honestly curious what your thoughts are on it. But that's in some ways I agree, and for me, the pathway to get there is not necessarily clear.
No, it's certainly a fair point. I think one thing I've always found funny, kind of speaking with politicians about this, is you try to get them excited about non-college pathways, and they'll, absolutely, like, this sounds great, this makes sense. But for a long time, they thought, like, okay, but you can't say that not everybody should go to college. Mm-hmm. And they started to kind of come off of that and like, well, maybe we can, but like, okay, but you still can't tell someone like their own kids shouldn't go to college. Like, it still felt like this third rail. And something that we've really tried to emphasize in our survey work and other research work we do is that this is just not true at all. The share of the American population for whom the college experience is actually working, you kind of described those top 2 quintiles. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The reality is that only half of the people who complete college even end up in a job that requires a college degree. Yeah. And so, to some extent, this is the social versus economic divergence. Okay, but they still got the social benefits, right? But when people look at the cost benefit, I think increasingly, even for many of those who got the social benefits, it's awfully hard to justify the cost in time and money. And so, what I've found, one really striking experience, I wrote a piece a few years ago now for the New York Times, basically mm-hmm. with this argument, like, we actually need to take a sledgehammer to colleges. I went and checked the comments afterward. Usually I don't read the comments, but I was like, actually, I'm really curious to see what the New York Times readers think of this. And it ran about 10-1 in favor of what I was saying. Mm-hmm. And the one against invariably worked for a college. And what was striking about the people in favor was that, yes, some really appreciated these kind of intellectual and statistical arguments. For most, it was because they had a personal story at this point, that we've kind of now come through a full generation of the broken college for all model, so that everybody has one of their own kids, one of their siblings, one of their close friends from high school, for whom it just did not work out at all. And so I think, when we poll, the last just kind of data point for me on this, we do tons of surveying. The single most lopsided survey question we've ever asked is support for tracking in high schools. Yeah. We tried testing it as diverse pathways versus tracking. People don't care. They call it tracking. Among middle class, 95-5. It's impossible to even get 95% people to actually read the question and answer it. So to get 95% on the same side, people want it. And mm-hmm. so I think you've made this point in your writing also, that you see this kind of increasing pessimism about college and its kind of value and how it's operating in economic terms, increasingly as a social force. Yeah. And so I think the time is ripe for the right, and obviously there's also part of the kind of political realignment work we do mm-hmm. at American Compass. There's a very plausible, vast majority of the population coalition behind saying, this is not working for the nation. This is not working for most people. Wait a minute, the few people who it is working for are the people that everything else is also already working for. Yeah. And so, yes, it's a very populist kind of approach to it. But, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. Just because you're populist doesn't mean the elites aren't ruining everything, aren't ruining something for everyone else.
Yeah, and there's something there in just kind of building on what you're sharing. In many ways, we've taken the college for all model and we've made the rest of civic life college for all. And so when you think about what childhood has become, the extracurricular arms race, all of the things that you now have to be in all of these competitive clubs to even have a chance to get into these competitive and expensive colleges, right? That is in somewhat downstream of what the admissions committee is looking for, right? Point. And that those expensive travel teams, those expensive extracurriculars, not only are they inaccessible for middle class and lower income kids, they pull talent out of the more accessible things and make those very accessible activities themselves less accessible and prevalent. And so a shift in the value of college in the adult transition can have significant implications for early life. And by the way, community for adults has also in many ways become pay to play. It's become in some ways a replication of those extracurriculars and that college where I have to, basically I'm a transactional member of a gym or an improv group or a workout class or all of these things. And that is mirroring a social experience of college for college educated people that people without degrees cannot access oftentimes because they're not living in those communities or they don't have the financial means to do so. And so the answer is a de-emphasis on that experience is also part of the answer because it depressurizes everything both before the adult transition and afterwards as well. That's
a great point. Well, we have to leave it there. Sam, this has been fantastic. We will drag you into writing for us some more, whether you want to or not. But our listeners can go find you many other places as well. We will put it all in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining the American Compass podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Warren.
We will be back again soon with another episode talking to yet another interesting person. Until then, take care.